presentations, or first at least with Lena Zipuri. We also will try to cover Batman Maths afterwards in the way that we have talked about. But first of all, I give the floor to you, Lena. Thank you.
Thank you, Sven. Thank you for inviting me. It's actually a great pleasure to be here for one very particular reason. Whenever Jakob and Mats and Charles and myself we speak in a conference or discuss, they are the good guys, they are the important ones, you know, Germany, the Scandinavian countries, they have all the success stories. And I'm coming from Greece and struggling to find something to say and explain why Southern Europe has not the possibility to do what the Northern European countries are doing. But here, in this particular context, I feel Greece matters, and that's why I'm particularly happy to be here. So I want to speak about something which my colleague Sofia Thanasopoulou and myself worked on, which we called the unintentional public procurement for innovation. And I think Jakob has already, in his initial presentation, made clear that sometimes procurers simply want something. They don't want to have innovation, they want to cover their need. And in this case, we get some unintentional innovations, unintentional in the sense that it was not the original target, but it may still produce interesting results. And I think it's a different question. How can you get unintentional innovation? What are the appropriate policies? Because eventually, if we agree that there is unintentional innovation, then there may be policies that can turn the unintentional into intentional. And this might be one degree easier than going for the big innovations. So what I want to tell you today is, first of all, speak about the public procurement for innovation as a concept very rapidly. Others have done it before me. But I will still go back into the definitions to simply document what Jakob was saying, that even incremental innovation and diffusion is public procurement for innovation, and there are joint forces with him against my co-author Charles Elquist. And then I want to say a few things on how we position public procurement for innovation in different dimensions, and why Greece matters in this context if we look at the ASEAN countries, because eventually that's a target here. I'll say a few things about the Greek experience. First of all, some generic institutional aspects. Greece is not a country which is famous for its institutional setup. It's famous for its culture, for being the cradle of civilization, you name it, but not necessarily for its institutional setup. And yet, even in less mature institutional setups, there may be some success stories. So I'll give you some of the success stories experience and refer to two failures. You know that failures are never well documented because actually nobody wants to be called a failure. So when you interview people and when it's a failure, they say, I have no time to see you, or, you know, it's a policy of our organizations not to speak with consultants and researchers. So there are just a few words about failures. And I will conclude with some lessons learned from Greece and what they mean for policy options. So, how did public procurement for innovation emerge as a concept? There needs to be a real need. There needs to be a sophisticated administration, and it originally started in countries which have world-leading multinationals. So not only is the procurer, the demand side, sophisticated, but also the producers are interested in creating lead markets. So this model worked, and it worked tremendously well in some cases, like, you know, Asea Brown Bovary and Ericsson, and the French high-speed trains. They were all developed as public procurement for innovation. They were not called so at the time they were developed. But they created what we call today lead markets. And this was policy. Policymakers succeeded. And once policymakers succeeded, academics came into the game and started investigating what made them succeed. And that's how the whole notion became popular. As Max very well pointed out in his presentation, when in the 90s we started speaking about that, the European Commission started being terrified. So this is a way to hide protectionism and go back to national protectionist policies. That's not the case. I think the model worked, and it can equally work transnationally, even if the Hamburg administration has to buy from the Netherlands. I think the key issue is the presentation of Jakob saying, you know, people want, people need, but when we come to demand, we need to translate that into willingness to pay. And I think the main issue for public procurement of innovation is to look at whether there is a willingness to pay. There are two definitions that even Charles agrees on. One is that public procurement for innovation goes into the early phases of innovation development, so it is related to radical innovations, and in the case when procurers really buy completely new to the world products. This is developmental procurement for innovation, or it's called creation oriented. There's something we suspect we can build, and we can build in competitive prices. We have never seen it before. We haven't seen it in the US or Japan or South Korea or Germany. But, you know, technologists and engineers tell us we can build it. You know, iPhone, smartphones in general, a new computer, an airplane, whatever. We know we have the physics and the engineering behind it, we just haven't seen the product. And this can really create massive success. But on the other hand, there is what Jakob called the diffusion of innovation, which may be simple diffusion, or usually, I would argue, it's adaptive. It's not just that it's something that they have developed in the US, and some US companies are selling it, but there is massive demand. So what we do is we simply diffuse it. We orient public procurement towards helping to diffuse this existing product. Usually, it needs to be adapted. It needs to be adapted to the local market. It needs to be adapted to the scale of the procurer. It needs to be adapted even in different languages, cultures, consumer patterns, whatever. So the innovation here is needed for a product or a system that is incrementally changed, and this is due to specific requirements or adaptations for local conditions. Now, local is a tricky word, because local may mean a city, or it may mean a macro region. ASEAN, as a total, is a region that I guess would need adaptation to local conditions, and it's not exactly the same demand as Europe or the United States. If you want to access larger markets, you need to be probably cheaper, you need to be incorporating features that are important for Southeast Asia, and so on. So my first point in this presentation is to say that actually this adaptation or diffusion orientation PPFI should not be neglected. It's not negligible. And we can even go a step further and say that it can be a simple technology transfer for larger systems. So if you change scale from small to large, or even from large to small, you need a simple technology transfer. The adaptation is even easier. And my last point, and I'll come back to that in some of the success stories in Greece, is that public procurement for innovation may even refer to business processes and non-technological innovation. So if the supplier learns how a public service works, tax system, customs, whatever, it is important, because there you can, in particular in ICT technologies, improvise and work out new and better solutions. But in fact, it's a business process, and actually companies don't like the business processes of the public service. They are too complex, they are too risk averse. So if you ask a company to set up a system for tax declarations, they will usually go and conceive it in a way companies work. Well, the public sector does not work in the same way as companies work. And this is why learning the business processes is also a merit in the procurement process. Now, in these definitions, I think there are three dimensions that we should consider. I mean, the basic dimensions like the innovation cycle, procurement cycle, and so on, they have been discussed already. But I think the important thing is to look at the type of innovation, but also look at the likelihood of having a public purchasing. That's why I agree with Jakob again that pre-commercial procurement is not actually procurement of innovation, because there is a likelihood of public service, but no assurance. And the third dimension is what type of rewards do we expect from this specific scheme? So private and social returns on investment, but there are certain risks that we need to take into consideration. There's always a danger when public policy becomes fashionable to go overboard, and I will come back to that with specific ideas. So, keeping in mind that adaptive and diffusion-oriented public procurement is important, that it is important to look not only at the high rewards, but also in moderate rewards and what can be done. I think I should explain why I think Greece matters. First of all, Greece is a moderate innovator. This is a community jargon, and I'll show you in the next slide what it means. But in any case, Greece is not Germany, Greece is not a Scandinavian country, it's not the UK. It has very different characteristics, and off the record, I would argue that they may be closer to Malaysia than to Denmark or Sweden. And the other interesting story about Greece is that there have been several efforts to support industrialization of the country, and because Greece joined the European Union long after Germany and the UK, we have some attempts that go back into an institutional framework that was not bound by the public procurement directives. So we would think that this would be more conducive to innovation. You know, like all paradoxes are interesting, and we actually came out that the more conducive environment led to fewer innovations. So what is a moderate innovator? If we break down, I'm sorry, this is the 2010 scoreboard, there are more recent ones, but they don't change much. What is important for you to understand is that in Europe, we break down the member states into 4 categories in terms of their innovative behavior. So we have the innovation leaders, you know, the best companies, Denmark, Finland, Germany, and Sweden. They are still the leaders in 2013 and 14. And these are the countries where there is a culture for innovation, there is a culture for innovation policy, and there are companies that are interested in creating lead markets. So this is the good part. These are the cases we usually refer to in the literature. There are innovation followers, which are the countries that are coming immediately after the leaders. Some of them, like Austria, have a target to become an innovation leader. And these countries have partly the institutional setup and the companies in place. And then come moderate innovators. Greece is part of it. These are countries where I'll show you in a minute how Greece is positioned there. You know, no major companies interested, no sophisticated administration. So if we try to position policies based partly on the degree of innovativeness, so radically new technologies or incremental and diffusion-oriented technologies on the one axis, and then how likely it is to get money, to make money out of a public purchase, you can see a very simple matrix, 2 by 2. The real thing is guaranteed public purchase for radically new technologies. ASEA Brown Boveri, electricity, Ericsson Nokia, rapid trains, whatever. There, I think the essence is that there is a very strong user-producer interaction. The public service, which is the user, is determined to work, to succeed, to get something new, to become also world leader in terms of utilization. And the public service wants to work together with the supplier and has the expertise and the skills to work together with the supplier. And this is the high risk, high reward market. Conversely, if there is an almost a combination of supply and demand side instrument, which I think was mentioned already, where the state pays a lot of money. In the case of DARPA, the Defense Agency of the United States, it's a huge amount of money for very radically new technologies. You know, it goes in the sphere of imagination. What can be done? And there you have a very high degree of failures. But still, the state or the federal government does not want to guarantee purchasing. DARPA says, I'm calling, I'm preparing a call for proposals, and I launch a call for radically new technologies to do that and that in high-speed drones. And I select 2 proposers, 2 different technologies, and I pay for the development of these technologies. And actually DARPA is very proud to say 70% of our contracts are a failure, but the 30%, they really break new ground. But nobody guarantees that they will be bought by the American government. Actually, correlation is very high, because these 30% that succeed, they produce something that is useful for the US government, and nobody else has produced. So the likelihood that it will be bought is very high. A similar thing is SBIR, but SBIR needs a longer discussion, because SBIR is sometimes radically new and sometimes only incremental.
Sorry, is the SBIR from the National Science Foundation?
It's not only the National Science Foundation. All the major US agencies need to block 2% of the research budget in an SBIR contract. So it's National Science Foundation, it's the National Health Institute, it's
ministries also, departments.
It's the energy department. I think there are 7 major agencies in the US that are obliged to earmark their 2% for SBIR, and DARPA is furious against this 2%, and some people say it's not worth it. But this is a long story. I'm just describing schemes. Lead market initiatives and technology platforms are the same thing. This is more European. And more recently, there is this story of prizes, which have actually started from private foundations in the US, where an agency, foundation or a public agency, can suggest a need, and they say, I'm launching a prize. Whoever comes up with the best prototype, I give them the prize. So I have $1 million, and I'm not going to purchase, to give it to one contractor and purchase it, but whoever comes up with the best design, your risk, if you come up with something that comes second, will get $1 million. So this is about the radically new technologies, and then we have the incremental innovations, non-R&D based innovations, and the hidden innovations mentioned this morning. And this is the adaptive or diffusion-oriented public procurement for innovation, where user-producer interaction is useful, but it's not always the case. And there we have the PCP, where the likelihood of public purchase is there, but it's just a likelihood. And when I look at PCPs in the European Commission, I think ex post the likelihood is not so high. There are other SBIR projects, there are small local government initiatives, and there is also the subsidizing of demand, which does not always succeed, and in some cases there is a government failure. I'll come back to that. So if you look at the same matrix, and you try to position who as a country is more appropriate to go into which area, then I think it's pretty clear that for guaranteed public purchase and radically new technologies, it's innovation leaders that can do it. It's the high risks, the high requirements, the sophistication needed, you can't find it everywhere. I'm not saying it's a must, it's absolutely forbidden, it's carved in stone that nobody else could do it. Innovation followers sometimes are good at it, so France with high-speed trains. But in general, these high rewards in terms of both social and private returns on investment, it's unlikely that you will find them in moderate innovators. Whereas schemes where you have a likelihood of public purchase and radical innovation, there I think that moderate innovators in the selected niches where they can be very good, they could work, this could work out. Conversely, for incremental innovations, this can be done in all countries. I would actually think that sometimes the likelihood of public purchase combined with incremental innovation or adaptive innovation, when you go into moderate or even modest innovators, which is the lowest group in Europe, there may be a problem that these policymakers try to imitate fashionable schemes and eventually end up with a government failure. I don't want to say it too loudly because this would risk throwing the baby with the water, but what I'm trying to say is that actually if you want to embark in a policy like that, you have to be very careful on what are your strengths and what are the areas you target. If you are over-ambitious, the risk of failing is very high. If you do nothing, well, it's a pity because you're not taking advantage of a significant purchasing power of the country for innovation. So this was my introduction, quite long, and I go now into the Greek experience. What is Greece? Greece is a country in southeastern Europe, which is known for its ancient successes, but in modern history, Greece has been an independent state for nearly 200 years, and it has grown in episodes. So it started as a very, very poor agricultural country in the mid-19th century, and it has gone through several very, very high growth episodes, growing much, much faster than other European countries or even the US. It was a model of development in the first post-war decades. That was the last really very successful growth episode. But then the national economic policy failed to shift from a low wage into a knowledge-based economic model, and it ended up in this persistent recession that you probably read in the papers since the last credit crunch and economic crisis. The problem for Greece, the curse or the blessing, you may name it whatever you choose, was that it became a member of the European Union and the European Monetary Union, which deprived it from the possibility to devaluate its currency. It deprived it from the possibility to use support in terms of state aid that would end up in affecting competition rules. So it had to play the game with the rules of very developed countries, innovation leaders, innovation followers. And to the extent that it will manage to work in this direction, and I belong to the optimists who believe it will eventually, that was a good thing. If it derails and goes bankrupt, it was a bad decision. But the important thing is to know that Greece is a kind of a country which is in the middle between advanced countries and developing countries. What happened to Greece before it joined the European Union In the early 80s, actually Greece joined in 1981, but in the first years after accession it was in a so-called transition period, so it was not bound to respect public procurement rules. And the government adopted something that was called programmatic agreements, and that was meant to be adaptive public procurement for innovation. It was not called that way, but it was agreements from the major utilities and the government, so Public Power Corporation, Telecommunications Authority, at the time a monopoly, and the government tried to associate the procurement of these utilities with technology transfer that would combine procurement of large systems with local value added, so coupling international technology providers with national companies working together with them. This entailed legal obligation of compliance, this was actually against the legal obligation of compliance with internal market rules, so it had to be abandoned. And I'll come back to that and explain when and how. After that, there were, in the last 10 years, 15 years, when these schemes were abandoned, there were several efforts. The most generous one was the significant solar energy tax incentives for diffusion of technology. And the most important, in my view, was the unintentional public procurement for innovation for the coverage of the public administration needs. So I want to go very rapidly through the early 1980s and this idea of coupling local value added with international technology transfer. These programmatic agreements were signed between the major utilities and providers, but the policy had limited success. And I think this is an important point to discuss and maybe investigate in other moderate innovators globally. You know, if you're trying to organize protectionist industrial policy and hope that this will bring in technology transfer and the innovation, can this work? And I think my experience from the case studies of Greece, we don't have a large population of cases and to make a statistical analysis, but the case studies indicate that this protectionism actually tends to increase prices, guarantee local value added, but no innovation. Since 1990, actually, all innovation policy shifted to the supply side. There was structural support from the European Union to Greece to organize its research and innovation policy, and all went into grants to companies, grants to research organizations, increasing university capabilities, funding PhD courses, and so on, because the country lacked the main requirements that are needed to engage for public procurement for innovation. It lacked a dynamic local business sector willing to push for technological development. The business sector would rather get supply-side grants, much easier, less risky, and it lacked sophisticated public demand. So why embark on it? However, there have been some cases in which where public procurement played a substantial role for the competitiveness of the local productive sector. Few cases, but very successful. And what I think we can say fairly securely is that they happened. They were not supposed to foster innovation. They happened because the public service needed to modernize in some cases. So I'll present just a few success stories. I think the highest success story is customs software. The European Union has a common customs software that has to integrate what is needed, because there is in the single market, the external barriers for trade are common to the whole of Europe. Now, the Greek company, Intrasoft International, gained an international competitive advantage due to the low budget procurement of the Greek Customs Authority. The Greek Customs Authority had to adapt to the European standards because it could not work otherwise. It's, you know, tax authorities are different. Every country has its own tax regimes and organization. But the customs had to be the same. So the Greek Customs Authority needed to have a software that was up to date, good, rapid, effective. But Greece is not a very rich country. It is rich compared to all the countries in the world, but it's one of the least rich countries in the European Union. So the budget it offered to its procurer was among the lowest. But it was a Greek company, and the procurer wanted to resolve a specific problem linked to the coordination of national customs. There was something there. It was a complex thing, not in terms of any radical innovation, but the small scope of the contract was not of interest to the large companies. So the Greek company entered the market. In 1995, 1998, they developed an integrated customs information system which allowed the supplier to gain insight into EU customs and practices. So this very small contract that nobody was interested in gave the procurer the possibility to understand the business processes and requirements of a customs union.
And then, well, what happened now to the company? Did more cases happen afterwards?
I'll come back. I'm coming to that. It took a little longer than it would have taken if everything was smooth, because actually the customs authority in Greece, they did not know what they wanted. They wanted to have a system compatible to the European system, but they could not describe the functionalities. They could not describe exactly what they wanted. They could not say exactly what was not compatible at the moment. So we had a real co-development of client and supplier, not because this was intended to be the case, but simply because the original terms or reference were not good. They were imprecise. So the two had to start working together if they wanted to have a final product. And what happened, in fact, is that at the end of the project, the supplier had acquired the knowledge about the business procedures, and in addition, it had a reference. And I think this is an important part of what the public authorities can offer the suppliers. Because if you go for an international tender, and you may be the best in the world in terms of skills and knowing how to organize something, but if you don't have a reference, something, even if of smaller scope and more limited requirements has worked in the past, you're usually not considered. So the supplier got two things, got knowledge and got a reference. And with this, they could start working with European countries when it came to complex upgrades of the contract. And these contracts were larger, and then fierce international competition started, because for larger contracts there were more companies interested, and very large companies. So what the Greek company did was go into consortia with bigger companies, and that's how it became a globally recognized leader. And eventually, when other countries started joining into the need to modernize their customs software, the Greek company was one of the global leaders, still too small to go to Brazil or Russia or Japan alone. And then they decided to go into a major cooperation agreement, and who would be the best? IBM. So when demand started to exceed its capacity, they joined forces with IBM to serve the markets of Southeast Asia. IBM was tier 1, but the system was always a joint project between Intrasoft and IBM. So meanwhile, the system is used in 40 to 50 countries worldwide. That's from my interview, which is a year old. Hopefully it's 50 to 60 now. So this is the big success story. There are other stories which are not as successful as that. It's for the tax system, where the Greek company is now also working for the UK partly. There's a social security system. I want to go into another company. There are 2 or 3 Greek companies that are global leaders. And Intralot is a company that specializes in the running of lotteries. And it has benefited from the local lottery system. You know, Greeks are fans of football and all kinds of gambling. So the company has also become a world leader. This is a niche market. It's not like the customs authorities that have to upgrade their software every year or every second year. But still, it's a company that has 5,500 employees today, and it is also working for the lottery systems from South America to North Asia. I don't think it's active in Southeast Asia, but it is in South America, in North America, all over Europe. Now, this was all unintentional. This was just to cover the needs of the public sector. But because of the experience with the programmatic agreements, and because the Public Power Corporation is a very important buyer, there was an effort to exercise procurement for the Public Power Corporation to work with procurement in local industry. And this has never worked. I don't know why, I can't say why. The interviews say that the lawyers in the Public Power Corporation have always insisted that the most economically advantageous tender is something that has been the uncontested clause. I think Jakob also mentioned already, some people are simply not to be convinced that there is something beyond that. And actually, I think one of the reasons is litigation. You know, people are afraid that if they go beyond €1 of the meat, they may end up in court. And why should they? What do Public Power Corporation managers care about the social return of investment in the country? So this was one intentional effort that failed, and there is another intentional effort that failed. You know, Greece is a very sunny country, and although it's a very sunny country, it has not managed to take advantage of solar energy. A few startups in the 80s, one of them a subsidiary of British Petroleum, failed. British Petroleum sold its subsidiary, and Greece has been buying actually solar energy, solar cells and heating material and everything, initially from Germany, now from China. And suddenly, because of the Kyoto Protocol and the agreements to reduce CO2 emissions, the government thought, okay, so why don't we subsidize residential investments heavily? And if there is a large demand, then we will hopefully have Greek companies emerging from the ground. There were 2 mistakes in that. First of all, the technology is now fairly mature. So when you have something massively produced in China, no matter what you do in Greece, it's very unlikely that you will ever succeed to become competitive. On top, it was bad timing. It came at just before the beginning of the crisis, so who would invest in Greece? And last but not least, the subsidies were simply too generous. So it created a huge market. As agricultural subsidies were diminishing, everybody was trying to shift into the subsidies for solar energy. It ended up with no spillovers, and the Troika monitoring forced the Greek government to reduce the subsidies because of the austerity policy and the need to reduce the public expenditure in Greece. So that was a huge flop, because there were companies and households that had invested in that. They're furious against the government, changing the rules of the game. No local capacity was created, no technology transfer, except some installation services, which are now unemployment because there is no more demand for it. So I'm maybe exaggerating a little bit to make the presentation more attractive after lunch, so that you don't start with a siesta. But I think I can, with a grain of salt, say that unintentional public procurement for innovation has succeeded and intentional has never succeeded in Greece. That does not mean that public procurement for innovation is a bad thing. It's an interesting thing. It's just you need to find out ex ante with a lot of effort how you can turn unintentional into intentional, how you can really go into more public procurement for innovation that has the right ingredients to succeed. And I think that for countries like Malaysia or Indonesia or Thailand or whatever, this is really the challenge, to find the right niche. So I think there are these two main lessons. Relatively small markets, they can do something, but they should not be over-ambitious. Don't try, I mean, if Greece tries to reinvent, to invent the magnetic train, I don't think there's a chance. But if it tries to go into better waste management and larger plants for waste management, then it has a good chance. ICT, environment, energy are probably the best sectors. And so, actually, this is where I would position Greece. I think this is the interesting story. Guaranteed public purchase for incremental innovation. Now, you could theoretically also go for likely public purchase, but I think the business sector will not react to likely, because the setup of the incentives is not the appropriate one. So, final presentation. I think I still have 5 minutes.
Sure, yeah.
Policy discussion. If you really want to make intentional public procurement for innovation, you have to identify the appropriate moment for adaptation. So the end of the early stages of product development cycle, companies that want the reference, and areas where adaptation is needed. Not too early, no radical innovation, but not too late, because at a certain point of time, the adaptation will end and the products will become off the shelf. Then it's not public procurement for innovation anymore.
Is that linked also to the level of innovation of each country? So the more the countries more developed on innovation have different tendency?
No, because the technological development of the country is not level playing. You know, you may have much better innovative capacity in food production than in marine biology, or in ICT than in textiles. So it very much depends on the strengths of the country. The second question is, does it make sense to go for lead market initiatives? So target the global market. I think this can happen in certain niches, and it has happened sometimes. So the customs authority software, but it's the exception, not the rule. Does it make sense to organize pre-commercial procurement, SBIR type initiatives? SBIR has been the buzzword all over the world in the last 5 years, and everybody is trying to set up an SBIR scheme. I'm not saying SBIR is not a good scheme. I'm saying, A, it's not necessarily public procurement for innovation. B, it's not the same animal everywhere. It's not the same animal even within the United States. If you look at the 7 different agencies that are practicing SBIR, you will see different performance and different rules. So SBIR type, maybe, yes, but be careful, it's not a panacea, it's not good for everything. And then, if you want to do it, you have to go into Max's presentation and see what is the best institutional setup. You need to organize procurement agencies. How can you do it? There are several models. The Netherlands, the functional requirements. I was impressed by a presentation I heard in UNCTAD a couple of months ago from Sri Lanka, and I can send you the link to those of you who want, because it seems that it was a very successful case of a joint sectoral public procurement organization in ICT. And because ICT is typically an area where you need adaptation, this may be a very interesting case to go for. This is informal again. I was wondering whether I should ask to stop the video, because in Greece the successful cases have all been around specific owners of companies and specific contacts, and this has sometimes even ended up in court cases. Now, court cases were not gained, they were lost, but it brings me to suggest that there are champions. There are champions from the side of the public administration, so people who, for their own reasons, because they want to become politicians, because they like to attract attention, because they are gamblers, because whatever, they go for such things. And there are champions from the private sector. And these are the companies that where the founder or the owner is overambitious. He wants to become a big company. It's maybe one of the ingredients of gazelles. So I think the personal touch plays an important role. I don't think it can be incorporated into policies, but it should not be forgotten. So I think I want to finish my presentation with 3 important questions to the countries who want to go further for public procurement for innovation. First, is there political support for combined supply and demand policies? And is this political support strong enough to allow for policymakers to take the risk of experimenting? The answer is very difficult to be yes. So if you don't have political support, I suggest you don't start. Some political backing is necessary. If there is political backing, are the means and tools available to do so? Because means, it's money. Public procurement for innovation costs always more than off-the-shelf procurement. It may be less worthwhile, it may have lower qualitative specifications, but it's cheaper. So if you don't have the money, you can't go for it. But not only the money, there are tools for it, specific tools. I'll refer again to the risk management tools. But before you go into risk management, there are lots of other tools that have already been described. And last but not least, what are the main barriers that might inhibit this policy adaptation, and can the policymakers and the political authorities take care to minimize them? And this is important. Political support can come from many areas. When I was writing the chapter for the book and I was doing some internet search, I realized the House of Lords in the United Kingdom has been the most prominent political support. I mean, nobody listens to the House of Lords. The House of Lords has done a lot of work and a very explicit policy recommendations that goes further than what the European Commission or any researcher would dream of. And this is support to the policymakers to fight against barriers. So, conclusion, it's worthwhile, it can be done everywhere, provided you have good policies, good political backing, and persistence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lena, for this very clear and interesting presentation. I think also you made a link to Southeast Asia very nicely. I think there's so much meat in this that we could just kick off now with a big discussion. I have several questions, but I don't know, are there any particular responses now for this? Max?
Yeah. Which one is it? This one?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have. Yes, some comments, but maybe as small. I think what strikes me is that this is, in a way, an implicit critique against the ambitions of cross-border procurement. This is actually the realization of the Porter argument about creating a home market and from there go abroad. So you start the journey in a local market. I remember having this discussion some years ago, when I think I first myself encountered this ambition with cross-border procurement in order to boost these companies. And I had some kind of theoretical suggestion that you should maybe start from this on this ground scale, but actually start from below. That's, if you look at many emerging radical technologies, that's how they start. It's small loop, fast loop learning that creates knowledge, which makes this technology strong and can then be shipped to other countries. So I think this success case is really, really interesting. Then
sorry, can you repeat the comment and the critique, because I didn't understand.
yeah, well, so if we argue in favor of cross-border procurement, this, in a way, what you're saying all the time through your presentation is that maybe it's not this big, giant projects, but actually something where there is local ability, local demand, that start in a more humble way, but actually in a real way, where there is a connection between ability to supply and there is a demand. And then from that creates competitive advantage, which can then emerge internationally. Which would be the Porter argument, where the emphasis I referred to then would be the importance of the home market as a starting point for expansion internationally. Then I have something from a policy. If you think of public procurement or innovation as a policy instrument, that means you should not use it unless it is needed. And on a general level, that would mean that you should actually not be so sorry if public procurement of innovation was not so much emphasized among the innovation leading countries, but actually the focus would be on those on the lower levels. But that's just like a conceptual understanding of what policy how policy should be executed, I think. Just a comment to the matrix. I don't know, you look skeptical.
Okay.
And then I have just two more. These cases, I also refer to them, ABB, Ericsson and so on. I think over the years, I heard more and more unofficial stories about at least some of them, and I think if we think of them as something that shows that public procurement in this demand-command sense, like we put up a contract and then someone should deliver it, like the Edquist's definition. If we think that those cases are actually were implemented in that way, then I think we really are in a problematic situation, because they had the Ericsson story is that they actually had some technologies from the defense industry that the engineers played around with. They wanted to do that, and so they were basically waiting for the public response. So it was more or less a supply side thing, and you also have this development pair, the Friedlund notion. So it's a little bit incommensurable also because at that time they could have this interaction, and it was much more informal, and probably so also for legal reasons. I mean, they did things which you would not really be able to do today. So one should be careful there how to formulate it. And then just this pre-commercial procurement thing. I worked a little bit with David Boss at that time in our project where we tried to diffuse knowledge about pre-commercial procurement. And I know Charles has boldly claimed that this is not public procurement or innovation. I just want to, for the record, say that I strongly disagree. This is definitely the ambition from the European Commission that this should be used as a tool for procuring innovation. But what is built into this scheme is the ability, is risk management. Although I know also that people might think of it as just development, and then when they come to the commercial stage they should just leave it. But the genuine intention is that it's only there to avoid, to allow for risk taking and distribute risk. And then comes the competitive thing. It was actually the treaty aspect that maybe complicated the whole thing a little bit. Yeah, now stop.
Do you want to respond to that, or do you?
There was no question. I think we disagree clearly on the PCP thing, because to me public procurement is there when there is a guaranteed public purchase. I'm not saying PCP is bad. I have also worked with lead boards, and I think it's something that's very interesting. But there is no guarantee of purchase. So
let's, we should come back to this so that we don't.
Now, what you said about Ericsson and the development pair of Fridlund, which is also a Brown Boveri, not only Ericsson. Well, I don't see where we disagree. I mean, it happened before Sweden joined the European Union, okay, but it was a good story. And procurement was there, even if engineers had the technology, had there not been for the public procurement. And I refer to the work by Marina Kelvy, that's what I have read, the public procurement played a crucial role.
Yeah, I'm just saying that it's a. Yeah. I'm just saying that if we think, I would say it justifies the argument favoring interaction between a public procurer, a public agency, and a supplier. But the mechanisms were they are not the perfect examples of the textbook demand side public procurement of innovation thing. Yeah, it's just which I read into that slide. So it's just a matter of degree, I think. In general, we agree, but I just think one should be careful with exactly how one used these early stories.
Yeah, but I think it's interesting to say that what is the model? Because to me, ABB and Ericsson are models in this user-producer interaction, really at the front of technology and state-of-the-art. No matter where the original idea comes from, it is a model story of radical innovation in lead markets.
I don't know, maybe others have to join in. I don't want the academics to monopolize the discussion.
Yeah, so
We can.
I would have something to say, but I actually would like to. Maybe others.
But maybe you can intervene also to the models.
If at all, I would intervene to the PCP thing, because anyway.
are you going to intervene, or am I going to intervene? Because I have a question or a comment, because I think one thing that runs through your presentation has something to do with policy mix. That this practice or policy cannot really work in isolation. It needs, as you also ended up with, this commitment to push this in a mix of supply side and demand side policy environment, if you put it that way. And for example, I think also in the sense that you gave much attention to diffusion-oriented, let's say, policy or ambition, diffusion-oriented, adaptive policies. Then it strikes me also that IPR policy is much linked to this, especially when you put global challenges into the equation. That is, in many cases, there is a much greater need to diffuse technology throughout the economy, at least in many countries where these things take up happen very slowly. I remember in China, for example, this is a big problem because of perverse incentives that are surrounding the companies, so they can pollute as much as they want, emit as much as they want. It doesn't really matter. So there's no sort of incentives to adopt new technologies, and there is therefore a good case also for very lax government-supported IPR policies to help to diffuse these things. So in that sense, there is a link between that, between procurement practice and policy, and lax technology policy or IPR policy. Could be. Another thing I would also like to raise, and more as a question, what about cluster policy in this equation? We often think about this in terms of individual companies that are competing for these tenders. Is there a way to promote this procurement policy, if you will, for more broader cluster policy? And what is the case in countries where the demand is has a very low aggregation, very low demand? What would be the sort of the optimal policy mix or strategy be in the cases where the demand is very low and immature? I remember Philippines, for example, where actually more than half of the economy is informal. So is there a case for, that's an open question. You don't have to answer it. It's more an open question.
In terms of the combined supply-demand, I totally agree, and it doesn't even have to be explicitly combined. The companies that go for such contracts are companies that need to at least develop their skills, and they develop their skills via supply-side instruments, not via demand side. So in this I agree. In terms of cluster policy, I'm not sure there is a connection when we go for adaptation and diffusion. And for the informal economy, I think it's an interesting question. I think Jakob already mentioned that in his survey it was clear that in the UK SME, it's in favor of larger companies, and SMEs are not so much part of it. So I would suggest that the informal economy is even a step lower. So probably cluster policy and informal sector are not the best applicants.
Anyone else want to comment shortly before we go on with the last presentation?
Shortly. I mean, if no one else has something to say, maybe just a comment. I don't think it's a question. I found your presentation for this setting extremely important, really, because maybe some of the Greek conditions speak more to some of the countries that are involved on the Asian side. Not in all respects, but in a way, it was a realistic picture. So because you started with the limits of suppliers, I mean, of the innovation capacity in countries, and the limits of market sophistication and even of market size. So in a way, one could think, oh, that's a bleak picture, nothing happening here. And then there are still good stories happening. And despite all the institutional rigidities and problems that you also pointed out, so all of the ingredients of why it couldn't happen are there, and then it still happens, which I found very interesting. So, and then it reminded me almost of serendipity in knowledge production. That all of a sudden something is happening, and we don't know why. It wasn't really planned. And some of your success stories happened without a big plan ex ante. So I just thought to myself, it's very interesting to learn from these cases. What are the conditions under which we can make it more likely that despite all these context conditions that are not very favorable, things happen. And then we might not be able to repeat them all the time in the same manner, but we might increase the likelihood of them to happen because we understand what context conditions we need to make them happen. So it's very modest. But we should also not think we are not too technocratically think we can now identify the 7 or 8 tools and then we apply them and then everything will happen in these countries. That's maybe not what will happen. Greece has shown that whenever they tried, it didn't work. When they didn't try, it worked. So I find that really interesting. But we can learn for that also for policy. The second comment relates to these agencies. You mentioned Sri Lanka as an example, and I think Netherlands as an example. Maybe just add in another example. We made case studies in the UK, and in the National Health Service there was an agency that has moved away to another organization, National Innovation Center. What they did, they supported agencies in the national health sector to do complex public procurement, but they didn't. They came in and helped them to do it. But by helping them, they taught them how to do it, and they built up capacity, and then in subsequent years, these health bodies could do it themselves. So there was a very complex design competition, almost like a PCP, but then with a guaranteed purchase. At the end, something was bought. And it was very complex and a very interesting case study, but it only worked because someone with certain expertise and certain model came in and supported, and subsequently this organization did this complex thing itself. But as an aside, another finding of this study is that the IPR, you mentioned IPR, in this complex design competition that they did, was with a public body. And they developed and then bought a blood donor chair. So this doesn't sound like a great innovation, but nowhere on earth had ever developed a chair for donation of blood that had all these kind of functional specifications, that it really works much better than lying on a bed or sitting on a chair. So it's a perfect thing. So there's a huge market globally for that. But the IPR is with the health organization. And they say, well, it's not our business. We have the IPR, it's not our business. And the company that designed it was just a design company doing this for this organization. So there is a big opportunity for a lead market. It never takes off because of institutional rigidities. Last comment, House of Lords. I was just to put a bit grain of salt or whatever, because great report. I was actually privileged enough to be one of those who was in the House of Lords giving evidence to them, so I spoke to them and then it was part of the final report. So you could think highest level possible, big boost, not at all. It is just ignored. It is absolutely ignored, and the Tories do what they want. They don't really listen to the House of Lords even. Sorry about that.
I know, I mean, I think I said that, who listens to the House of Lords, but still the report was, you know, wow.